Last passage of test 3. Let's get started. This passage is adapted from this source. Colony collapse disorder is characterized by the disappearance of adult worker bees from hives. Okay, so definition of a term in the blurb. Let's go to the question. So how do the words can, may, and could in the third paragraph help establish the tone of the paragraph? Got a tone question here. This one's a little bit late in the passage. 43 is about line 42, though it's then also based on the passage, so it might be quite general. It's also actually followed up with a part 2 question. Another part 2 question, 35, is about the word postulate. So this is what I suggest. This one's about the fourth paragraph. Okay, so I suggest let's answer 42 first. Let's read all the way through the third paragraph. And in the third paragraph, we're looking for the use of the words can, may, and could, and how that affects the tone. Honeybees are hosts to the pathogenic large ectoparasitic mite, Varroa destructor, Varroa mites. These mites feed on bee hemolymph, blood, and can kill bees directly or by increasing their susceptibility to secondary infection with fungi, bacteria, or viruses. Little is known about the natural defenses that keep the mite infections under control. Pyrethrum are a group of flowering plants which include, I'm not going to bother reading those, and related species. These plants produce potent insecticides with anti-mite activity. The naturally occurring insecticides are known as pyrethrums. A synonym for the naturally occurring pyrethrums is pyrethrin, and synthetic analogs of pyrethrums are known as pyrethroids. In fact, the human mite infestation, known as scabies, is treated with a topical pyrethrum cream. Okay, now we're into the paragraph. We suspect that the bees of commercial bee colonies, which are fed monocrops, are nutritionally deficient. In particular, we postulate that the problem is a diet deficient in anti-mite toxins, pyrethrums, and possibly other nutrients which are inherent in such plants. Without at least intermittent feeding on the pyrethrum-producing plants, bee colonies are susceptible to mite infestations, which can become fatal either directly or due to a secondary infection of immunocompromised or nutritionally deficient bees. Blech, mouthful of a passage. This secondary infection can be viral, bacterial, or fungal, and may be due to one or more pathogens. In addition, immunocompromised or nutritionally deficient bees may be further weakened when commercially produced insecticides are introduced into their hives by beekeepers in an effort to fight mite infestation. We further postulate that the proper dosage necessary to prevent mite infestation may be better left to the bees, who may seek out or avoid pyrethrum-containing plants, depending on the amount necessary to defend against mites and the amount already consumed by the bees, which in higher doses could be potentially toxic to them. Okay. So what effect on the tone of this paragraph did the use of the words may, could, and can do? Well, it implies possibility, that this is a possible explanation. This is definitely not the reason. It's a hypothesis, right? It's a possible explanation. It's not at all necessarily the answer, right? So it's not trying to give a tone of, let's say, certainty, but a tone of kind of cautious optimism that this could be a really good explanation. They create an optimistic tone that makes clear the authors are hopeful about the effects of their research on colony collapse disorder. So everything was good until we got to the end, because this said nothing really about how this would affect colony collapse disorder, just that this could be a reason for the death of certain bees. So we can keep A just in case, but I'm hoping to find something a bit more precise. They create a dubious tone that makes clear the authors do not have confidence in the usefulness of their research described. This is a little bit too strong. Dubious means like doubtful. They are not really doubtful. They think their theory is right. They're just not going to fully commit to it. So we'll get rid of B. They create a tentative tone that makes clear the authors suspect but do not know that their hypothesis is correct. Yeah, right. Tentative means like kind of cautious, temporary and cautiously so. So if they're tentative, they are thinking that this is a good provisional, a good temporary theory that probably will work. It looks promising, but of course they're not 100% sure on. So C looks good, and I think it's better than A because A, again, it doesn't really talk about colony collapse disorder specifically in that paragraph. They create a critical tone that makes clear the authors are skeptical of claims that pyranthrums are inherent in monocrops. So this is a really good example of a recycled word choice, right? They're using pyranthrums or using monocrops, but this is not at all the main point of this paragraph. They're not skeptical of this. They, in fact, take this as... actually, they're not skeptical of this because this is simply not true. Pyranthrums are not in the monocrops. That's the problem that they're describing. So D just doesn't fit best with what we read. On the other hand, C does. 43, we read... No, we haven't read this yet. This is the next paragraph. I believe, if I saw correctly, there was a question on... Well, let's do 47. This one's on postulate. All right. We further postulate that the proper dosage necessary to prevent mite infestation may be better left to the bees. So I would say postulate here means like hypothesize, right? They're offering a provisional or temporary possible theory or explanation for something. Okay. Make an unfounded assumption. This is a bit too negative, a bit too uncertain, right? It's not unfounded. It's founded on data. It's founded on their evidence and their theories. So A is just a bit too negative. Put forth an idea or claim. Yeah, right? They're putting forth this idea, right? They're putting forth this claim about why something's happening. Question a belief or theory. No, they're not questioning anything. They're proposing a theory. Conclude based on firm evidence. This is the way too strong example. I think we saw something like this in a previous question. I think it was in passage 1. Conclude, or test 1. Conclude based on firm evidence, way too strong, right? When they're postulating, remember what we said for question 42, they're using words like can, may, and could. We don't really know for sure, or they don't really know for sure if their theory is correct. They hope it is, and they suspect that it is. So we can't go with something as firm as conclude based on firm evidence. So instead, we're going to go with B. Let's do 48. This is about the fourth paragraph. The main purpose of the fourth paragraph is to what? So let's read that and try to find what the purpose is. This hypothesis can best be tested by a trial wherein a small number of commercial honeybee colonies are offered a number of pyrethrum-producing plants, as well as a typical bee food source such as clover, while controls are offered only the clover. Mites could then be introduced to each hive with note made as to the choice of the bees and the effects of the mite parasites on the experimental colonies versus control colonies. Okay, so what is the purpose of this paragraph? It's to introduce a possible experiment that could test the hypotheses that they've laid out in the previous part of this passage. Summarize the results of an experiment that confirmed the author's hypotheses about the role of clover in the diets of wild-type honeybees. So we have some recycled words here as part of the issue with A, right? It's reusing clover, which we saw in the passage. But notice, and they are talking about an experiment, but they haven't done the experiment yet, right? This is a potential experiment, right? It can best be tested. It hasn't been done yet. So we don't really know what the results would be, whether it would confirm either way. And more importantly, I suspect this hypothesis that we've laid out is not just about clover. It's about the pyrethrum containing plants. So there's a whole bunch of things wrong with A. It sounds good. It seems like it fits with what you read with the reuse of these words, but it doesn't fit at all. Propose an experiment to investigate how different diets affect commercial honeybee colonies' susceptibility to mite infestations. Yeah, we'll give them different kinds of food. Some of them will get clover, some will get clover and other things, and we'll see how they compare when we introduce the mites. So that looks good. And notice propose an experiment fits perfectly. Provide a comparative nutritional analysis of the honey produced by the experimental colonies and by the control colonies. I don't think they mentioned anything about honey in this paragraph. Notice if you had read ahead, you would have seen recycled word, wild type honeybee, that's choice A, and you would have seen this, well, no, never mind. I thought this had to do with honey, but it's about honeybees. It's not about honey itself. So either way, nothing in C really fits. Predict the most likely outcome of an unfinished experiment summarized in the third paragraph. There was no experiment summarized in the third paragraph. In fact, the experiment was somewhat summarized in 4 in this paragraph. The third paragraph said nothing about the experiment. It was the theory, but not the experiment. So we can definitely get rid of D, and we will go with B. An unstated assumption made by the authors about clover. So this is a keyword question. We've already read clover previously, and the discussion was that clover is the typical bee food source. And the bees would be offered clover and a number of pyrethrum-producing plants. So what's the assumption here? Well, that clover doesn't produce pyrethrum, right? That it's just regular bee food. It wouldn't affect the experiment either way, right? It's going to be the control of the experiment. You feed some bees clover, you feed other bees clover plus pyrethrum, and you see how they do when you introduce the mites. That's basically what the experiment is saying. So A looks good, right? Do not produce pyrethrums. So again, notice this is not a very far step away, even though it's an assumption question, an inference type question. You're not really reading too far into this, right? They're going to be offered pyrethrum plants and clover. Therefore, we can assume that clover is not a pyrethrum plant, right? A very simple, basic conclusion. Are members of the Chrysanthemum genus? Oh, I don't know. So probably the opposite, because notice in the opening part of this paragraph where they talk about chrysanthemums, they say that the pyrethrums are in the chrysanthemums. So I don't think this is true, and it's not even in the paragraph you were looking anyway. Are usually located near wild-type honeybee colonies. Again, don't get drawn in by the recycled word, wild-type honeybee colonies, right? Maybe this is true, right? It could be true. It's a recycled word, but not mentioned. Not something we can assume. Will not be a good food source for honeybees in the control colonies. Again, we have no idea. Maybe. I mean, that's what they're kind of testing. They need to see do they need the pyrethrum to resist the mites? But A, again, with B, C, and D, they don't fit the passage. They go too far. And with D in particular, and with C to a certain extent, it's reasoning too far. It's reasoning way beyond what the passage allows you to reason. A is just a very simple step beyond it, which is why A is the answer. 50, 51, and 52 are about the table, so I will leave those for now. Let's go back to see what we skipped. So let's do... did we read this yet? I don't know if we read this part yet. Let's read this last bit. It might be beneficial to test wild-type honeybee colonies in this manner as well, in case there could be some genetic difference between them that affects the bees' preferences for pyrethrum-producing flowers. Okay, so what do we know in this question? In line 42, the authors state that a certain hypothesis can best be tested by a trial. Based on the passage, which of the following is a hypothesis the author suggests be tested in a trial? So we saw this earlier. The idea is, right, this is the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is whether the pyrethrums are necessary, the pyrethrum-containing plants are necessary in the diets of these bees to prevent them from mite infestations. Okay, so... honeybees that are exposed to both pyrethrums and mites are likely to develop a secondary infection by a virus, a bacterium, or a fungus. They say this is something that happens, or at least that the mites might cause these secondary infections, but this is not what the experiment would test. Beekeepers who feed their honeybee colonies a diet of a single crop need to increase the use of insecticides to prevent mite infestations. Again, they mention this. This is mentioned in the passage, but this is not the hypothesis that's being tested. A honeybee diet that includes pyrethrums results in honeybee colonies that are more resistant to mite infestations. This is exactly what's going on here, right? It's about whether or not the pyrethrum will prevent the mites, right? Anti-mite toxins are these pyrethrums. So C looks good. Humans are more susceptible to varroa mites as a result of consuming nutritionally deficient food crops. Says nothing at all about humans in this essay, so we'll go with C. Evidence for C. Maybe what I underlined here, so 21 to 24, maybe? Don't really see that here. Or maybe this right here. Yeah, without at least intermittent feeding on the pyrethrum-producing plants, bee colonies are susceptible to mite infestations, which should become fatal either directly or due to a secondary infection, blah, blah, blah. So this looks pretty good. Looks like lines 24 and on. So that's D. We'll just check the rest. So 3 to 5 talks about the secondary infections. If you picked A for 43, you would likely have picked A for 44, but that's not it. Oh, they actually do mention humans. I take that back, but only as a side note. And again, so if you picked D, you probably picked B for this one, but it has nothing to do with the experiment that was discussed. 19 to 21 just says that they are nutritionally deficient. It doesn't specifically say anything yet about the pyrethrums. That comes later, as we saw in 24 to 28. Okay, looks like we've got 45 now. The passage most strongly suggests that beekeepers' attempts to fight mite infestations with commercially produced insecticides have what unintentional effect? So we have a keyword question here, right? It's the bit about insecticides. So I remember reading something about that. Right here. In addition, immunocompromised or nutritionally deficient bees may be further weakened when commercially produced insecticides are introduced into the hives by beekeepers in an effort to fight mite infestation. So in other words, what happens when you use the insecticides to fight the mites? Well, it actually weakens the bees further. So they increase certain mite populations? No. They kill some beneficial forms of bacteria. They mentioned bacteria in this passage, but that wasn't mentioned in this discussion of insecticides. They destroy bees' primary food source, not mentioned at all, right? Not mentioned in the passage. They further harm the health of some bees. Yeah, that's exactly what we see, right? Further weakened, further harm. Fits perfectly. So, following up on 46, we're probably looking for the answer between 31 and 35, and we find it. But again, we always check all four choices just to double check. 1 and 2 says nothing about insecticides. 6 to 7, nothing about insecticides. 47 to 50, nothing about insecticides. C's got to be our answer. All right, 46, 47, 48, 49. Okay, now we're going to do the graph question. So 50 first. Based on data in the table, in what percent of colonies with colony collapse disorder were the honeybees infected by all four pathogens? So we're looking for the colonies with colony collapse disorder. That would be this column. What percent is infected by all four pathogens? Well, that would be this column. Here's the all four pathogens row. So it looks like 77%. So we'll go with B. Based on the data in the table, which of the four pathogens infected the highest percentage of honeybee colonies without colony collapse disorder? So here's the colonies without colony collapse disorder. Here's the one that's the highest. So it looks like it's just going to be Nosema ceranae. So D looks good. Do the data in the table provide support for the author's claim that infection with Varroa mites increases a honeybee's susceptibility to secondary infections? So we look at this table. Notice the table shows us nothing about the Varroa mites. All we know is that these are colonies with colony collapse disorder for whatever reason. And I think they said the Varroa mites... I mean, they don't even say anything in this passage, to be honest. I mean, I guess they do, right? By the title of it, that the pyrethrum might cause, the lack of pyrethrum might ultimately cause the honeybee collapse disorder, colony collapse. But nothing in this table, right? This is based on the data in the table. Nothing in the table say anything about the Varroa mites. So we're not going to say yes, because this table, remember, limits of knowledge. We talked about this just previously about figures and graphs. Nothing in the chart says anything about the Varroa mites. So we cannot draw any conclusions based on the chart, even if the passage discusses it, if the chart doesn't support it. So we're going to say no. No, because the data do not provide evidence about bacteria as a cause of colony collapse disorder. I mean, they don't. Right? Nothing here says anything about bacteria, but that doesn't get to the original question, which is whether or not this data shows us that Varroa mites lead to secondary infections. So while C is kind of true, right? It's true in some sense. It's not really answering the question because it's not getting to the point of the Varroa mites. No, because the data do not indicate whether the honeybees had been infected with mites. Yeah, that's exactly the point that we made. This chart says nothing about whether they have mites or not. So we can't draw any conclusions about the mites and how the mites affect bees based just on the data in the chart. So we're going to go with choice D. Let's double check, make sure we've answered everything. We have. So let's move on to the next video.